There. Welcome to another episode of Needlepoint TV. I'm Ellen Johnson and I'm delighted to be here with you today. We're going to talk about needlepoint stitches for small spaces. So before we dive in, I would love to know where you're watching from. So make sure that you tell me in the comments. Just type in where you are in this great big wonderful world that we all live in. And if you're watching this as a recording, make sure that you also leave where you're watching from, because I do love to go back and check and see that too later after this broadcast is over. So stitches for small spaces, they can actually be a big challenge. You think small canvas, oh, this will be a piece of cake. But sometimes small stitches can be, or small spaces can be, one of the most challenging things about a needlepoint project if you want to use a decorative stitch there. Now, I should go ahead and say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with stitching a canvas entirely in the tent stitch, which a lot of people just call the needlepoint stitch. It's that slanted stitch at a 45-degree angle. Those projects that you stitched entirely in tent stitch are beautiful. They're timeless. They're classic. But if you do want to jazz things up a little bit, using decorative stitches and fancy threads is absolutely the way to go. So what are you supposed to do when you have a little bitty canvas? Like I have this cute little witch canvas. I think she is adorable. She has 3 friends too that I'm going to be stitching, but the spaces on her are not very big. And so that can create its own set of challenges. So here's a general rule, a general guideline. When you're working with small spaces on a canvas, actually, it's when you're working with any area. It doesn't matter what size it is. I mean, it just tends to be a little bit trickier when the space is small. But the general rule is you want to be able to get 3 pattern repeats inside of the area that you're going to be working. So what does that mean? That's a great question. So I printed off a stitch diagram here that I'm going to share with you so that you can see. So this is a diagram of the mosaic stitch. The mosaic stitch is a small stitch, so it's really good for small spaces. But in order to be able to successfully use this stitch, you really need to be able to get 3 repeats. That means 3 horizontal rows and 3 vertical rows. So in other words, 9 units in the area. And the reason you want to be able to do that is so that you can actually see the pattern become established. If you only can fit in a few little units or partial units, if you have an irregularly shaped area on your canvas, if you can't get full stitch units, you can only get bits and pieces, or if you can't get enough of the stitch pattern going, it becomes incredibly hard to tell what it is that you're trying to do unless you're the stitcher. If you know what you're trying to do, that's one thing, but when somebody else is looking at it, they may go, what the heck? And it may just look like a mishmash of thread on your canvas, and it doesn't convey the look that you're trying to convey. So keep in mind, anytime that you're trying to use a decorative stitch in an area, the general rule of thumb is to try and get 3 pattern repeats in the area. So and like I said, in the case of the mosaic stitch, you want to be able to get 3 horizontal and 3 vertical rows. Now, if you can only get 2.5, that's okay because the shape is irregular. But you want to be able to get enough to be able to tell what the pattern looks like. So, and I've got some notes here, so y'all bear with me. I want to make sure I get all these details in because I don't want to leave anything out. So that is, and that was the main thing I wanted to share with you. If you can't get those 3 repeats of the pattern in the area, then you need to find a smaller stitch. So talking about the mosaic stitch is a really, really good stitch for small spaces. And it's also a really good stitch for people who are new to using decorative stitches or canvas embroidery stitches on their projects. Now, I need to differentiate. There is a difference between canvas embroidery stitches and just decorative stitches. You can use surface embroidery stitches, things like French knots and lazy daisies and bullion knots. All of those can be used to embellish needlepoint canvases too, but they are not counted stitches. they don't require that you have so many vertical canvas threads and horizontal canvas threads that you have to count over in order to get the pattern established or get the stitch on the canvas. A surface embroidery stitch is more freestyle. So there is a difference between the two. And so when you're talking about pattern repeats, you're talking about canvas embroidery stitches, which is what we really talk most about when we talk about, or what most people think about when they think of decorative stitches on needlepoint canvases. So uses for the mosaic stitch, and I'm going to just hold this up so I don't, like I said, forget anything. Uses for the mosaic stitch: terrific background stitch. So if you've never tried decorative stitches before, then using the mosaic stitch for the background of a piece could be a good place to start. It's also good for architectural design components or design elements, things like buildings and houses. You can also use the mosaic stitch for clothing embellishment. And the next thing that is really all part of this, it's not just the stitches, but it's also the threads. So understanding how to pair threads with stitches is super important, because you don't want to spend a lot of effort on a really complex stitch only to have the thread detract from it and really your work being not even noticeable. So, for example, if you use the mosaic stitch for a background and maybe use just a wool thread, a simple classic wool thread, that's going to be very subtle. The pattern will be very subtle and subdued. Whereas if you use a really fancy thread, that's going to make that stitch really stand out. So if you were using the mosaic stitch for clothing embellishment or to create a pattern on a garment for one of the characters on one of your canvases, then, and say you use silk or metallic, then that would really make that pop and stand out. So it's going to, it's really going to become more of a draw to the viewer's eye. So again, your thread choice paired with your stitch choice makes a really big difference in, in the way that stitch shows up on your canvas. Another really good stitch for small spaces is the brick stitch. Now, the brick stitch is worked in, there are two ways you can work the brick stitch. You can work it in a two-pass row, which is where you work across and then you turn around and come back to fill in the gaps. That's the way I was taught to do it, and it's the way I stitch the brick stitch. But you can also do an up and down or an alternating motion where you do a stitch over two canvas threads on one plane, and then you jump down and do another stitch over two, and then you work back and forth. So you're going up and down in a more of a zigzag motion. So another example of how thread can make a huge difference in the way your finished project looks. Uses for brick stitch, let me jump back to that, can be things like backgrounds, also for clothing embellishment. But it's also a good stitch for grass. If you had a large expanse of grass, or if you had a small area of grass and you needed a stitch, you could use the brick stitch very successfully. If you wanted to use an over-dyed thread, though, that comes into play into which option or which variation of the brick stitch you might choose to work. If you have a very variegated or wildly variegated thread, multicolored thread, then you're probably going to want to use the variation where you go up and down. So it would be the alternating variation. And that's probably truthfully the one that most people are familiar with. The other variation, which is the two-pass row, that one is less commonly used, but and we'll save that conversation for another day about which one you'd use when. But if you're using a multicolored thread and there is quite a variation in the colors, I would suggest using that one where it just goes, the alternating variation. If you like to use more subtle variegated threads or more subtle over-dyed threads, then you could use the two-pass row. So either way, your thread choice can affect the way your finished stitch looks. So these are all the kinds of things that you have to keep in mind when you're choosing stitches and threads for your projects. That's why I love to advocate the use of a doodle canvas. If you've never heard of a doodle canvas, it's just simply a blank piece of canvas that you can use to practice stitches and threads off of your project. So it gives you a place to doodle with stitches and threads, kind of like a doodle pad or a doodle notebook if you were drawing. So finally, we have the last stitch. Of course, there are tons and tons and tons, but the last stitch that I'm going to chat about here today is the T-stitch. Now, the T-stitch is an open stitch, and that means that when you employ that stitch on your projects, some of the background is going to show through. The reason this is an especially good stitch is if you happen to have a project that has some beautiful shading on it and you want to let some of that shading show through. So again, it's more of an open stitch, and the lighter the weight of thread that you use, the more of the background is going to show through. So it's one of those that if you love the open look, then you're going to love the T-stitch, and it will work in just about any space. If you don't like the open look so much, then you're not going to want to use this stitch on your project. Some different uses for the T-stitch. I'm thinking we're coming up on the holiday season. Angel wings, that's a great place to use the T-stitch. And it's also a really good stitch for backgrounds. I know I've mentioned all three of these that I've talked about today are really good choices for backgrounds. Another option for the T-stitch is water. I like to use the T-stitch for water, and you can use two different, here's an example of some ways that thread can affect the way the T-stitch shows up on your project. If you wanted to use an overdyed thread, whether it's got a lot of variation in color or just a little bit, that can actually help to add a sense of movement to your canvas. Or if you wanted to use a thread that had some metallic in it, like a silk lame braid, then that could help create also a sense of movement, but it also could mimic the effect of the sun glinting off the surface of the water on a sunny day. So it really depends on what you're trying to convey through your choice of threads and stitches. But you do have to keep in mind that, that thread choice does affect stitches or the way the stitches show up. So you have to kind of play around with those things. And the more experience you have with different threads and the more experience you have with different stitches, the more equipped you're going to be to choose those stitches and threads successfully to create a cohesive piece of needlepoint art. So much to think about when choosing stitches and threads for your projects. Now, there are other small stitches that you can use on your canvases. There's a great stitch called the Kalem stitch. If you have a canvas that has garments on it, someone maybe a winter scene where a snowman is wearing a scarf or a little kid has got a hat on, or one of those Scott Church canvases where the chickadee's wearing the hat. The Kalem stitch is great to create a feeling really to create the illusion of a knitted garment. So it's a tiny little V's and really fun stitch to do. And it's small, so it fits in a lot of different kinds of spaces. You also have a stitch called the upright cross stitch. The upright cross stitch, if you think about a cross stitch is just an X. Well, an upright cross is just standing straight up. So you can use the upright cross stitch for a lot of different things. It creates a lot of texture. So lots and lots of small stitches that you can use for small spaces. Now, I just this past week, I guess you'd say published a brand new guide for 10 terrific small stitches that you can use on your needlepoint canvases. And I'm going to share where you can sign up for that. I'm going to put it on the banner. So let me pull it up right here. Let's see. Here we go. No, that's the blog post. Here we go. There it is. There's the guide. And mentioning the fact that we do have a blog post that goes along with this episode of Needlepoint TV, you can hop over to the Serendipity Needleworks website and read this week's blog post, because on that blog post, I also share the stitch diagrams for the T-stitch and the brick stitch variation that I use in addition to the mosaic stitch. So now I'm going to take a look and see if there are any questions that may have popped up. And if you're watching this as a recording, remember you can always leave your questions underneath as well, because I do try to go back and get those answered for you. So let me see if we have any questions that have popped up. All right. Nope, no questions. Stacy says I'm frozen. I hope I unfroze. Fingers crossed that I unfroze. We do have, okay, so great. Good deal. So I'm not frozen anymore. That's awesome. Okay, so I do, like I said, I want to invite you to check out that free guide. You can go to that to that link. Just type that in your browser on your computer, and I'll also share the link down below when we finish this video up so that you can click on that and go over and grab that guide. And I do have a new workshop that's happening at the end of this week, October 27th and October 29th. There will be information about that. If you're already a subscriber to Needle Notes, which is my weekly emails, you should have gotten some information about that. If you're not a subscriber to Needle Notes, then I'll make sure I include the information on how to do that down here below too. But when you grab that guide, the new 10 terrific stitches for small spaces, there's information on the page, on the thank you page, for signing up to get that guide that will lead you towards how you can sign up for that too. So I appreciate you being here with me today. If you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the red subscribe button. And if you want to get notifications for when new videos are uploaded, click that little bell. And I look forward to seeing you all again real soon. Thanks ever so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be here with me today. Until next time, my friend, happy stitching. Bye for now.